Welcome back to Chokitable Media.
What happens when a nation refuses to bend and a superpower threatens force? We're watching something extraordinary unfold. Nigeria, Africa's most populous country and largest economy, is standing firm against what President Trump has called a potential vicious military response. Now, let me be very clear about what's actually happening here, because the mainstream narrative misses the deeper currents at play. This isn't just another diplomatic spat or Twitter exchange. We're witnessing a fundamental shift in how middle powers are responding to American pressure in the post-unipolar world. Nigeria controls critical resources, oil, natural gas, rare earth minerals, that both Washington and Beijing desperately want to secure. But more importantly, Nigeria represents something larger: the African continent's growing refusal to accept the old rules of engagement. For decades, threats of military intervention were enough to bring governments into line. Not anymore. What we're seeing is the erosion of American coercive power, not through military defeat, but through the simple act of defiance by nations that have calculated they have more to lose by submitting than by standing firm. The question isn't whether Trump will follow through. It's what this moment reveals about the architecture of power in our changing world, and whether we're heading toward dialogue or devastation. Let me take you back to understand how we arrived at this dangerous precipice, because nothing in geopolitics happens in isolation. Nigeria's current standoff with Washington didn't begin with a single tweet or policy decision. This is the culmination of decades of accumulated grievances, broken promises, and a fundamental misreading by American policymakers of how the world has changed beneath their feet. You see, when I travel to Lagos or Abuja, when I sit down with Nigerian economists, civil society leaders, and yes, government officials, what strikes me most profoundly is not anti-American sentiment, though that certainly exists, but rather a deep sense of disappointment. Disappointment that the partnership they were promised never materialized. Disappointment that despite being told democracy and free markets would bring prosperity, what they got instead was structural adjustment programs that gutted their social services, trade deals that favored American corporations over Nigerian workers, and a security partnership that seemed far more interested in establishing military bases than actually addressing the terrorism that plagued their northern regions. Now, Trump's threat of what he termed a vicious military response didn't emerge from nowhere. It came after Nigeria made a series of decisions that Washington found intolerable. First, there was Nigeria's deepening economic cooperation with China. We're not talking about small-scale trade here. We're talking about massive infrastructure investments, railways, ports, refineries, telecommunications networks, the kind of transformative projects that Nigeria had been asking Western partners to fund for generations. When those partners said no or attached conditions that would have required Nigeria to surrender sovereignty over key economic decisions, China stepped in with a different model. Now, you can criticize aspects of Chinese investment strategy all you want, and there are legitimate concerns about debt sustainability and labor practices, but here's what you cannot deny. China built things, real tangible infrastructure that Nigerians can see and use. Compare that to decades of World Bank reports and USAID feasibility studies that never translated into actual development. Then came Nigeria's position on global energy markets. As Europe scrambled to replace Russian gas after the Ukraine conflict, Nigeria found itself in an unexpectedly powerful position. They have massive natural gas reserves, some of the largest in the world, and suddenly they were being courted by European nations desperate for supply. But Nigeria did something that infuriated Washington. They refused to simply step in as a replacement for Russian supply at terms favorable to the West. Instead, they began negotiating hard. They wanted technology transfers. They wanted joint ventures where Nigerian companies held majority stakes. They wanted commitments on climate finance that would help them transition their own economy. In other words, they saw the desperation of Western nations and decided to leverage it for their own development priorities. This is what sovereignty looks like in practice, and Washington was not prepared for it. But perhaps most significantly, Nigeria began to chart an independent course on international diplomacy. When the United Nations voted on resolutions condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine, Nigeria abstained. Not because they supported the invasion. Nigerian officials were quite clear in their opposition to violations of territorial integrity, but because they saw the hypocrisy in Western demands. How could the same nations that had invaded Iraq on false pretenses, that had destroyed Libya despite promising only a no-fly zone, that had enabled decades of Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories, suddenly claim the moral high ground on territorial sovereignty? This abstention wasn't anti-Western as much as it was pro-consistency. It was Nigeria saying, we will not be your automatic vote at the UN anymore. We will evaluate each situation on its merits based on our national interests and our principles, not based on pressure from Washington or Brussels. This independent stance extended to Africa more broadly. Nigeria, as a regional powerhouse, began working with South Africa, Kenya, and Ethiopia to articulate a distinctly African position on global affairs. They rejected the premise that they had to choose between the United States and China, between the West and Russia. They argued for what they called strategic autonomy, the right to maintain relationships with multiple powers and to choose their partners on different issues based on what served African development. This was deeply threatening to a Washington that had grown accustomed to a world where you were either with us or against us, where neutrality was treated as hostility. Now, the specific trigger for Trump's threat, and this is where things get particularly concerning, appears to have been Nigeria's announcement that they would begin accepting payment for oil exports in currencies other than the dollar. Let me explain why this matters so profoundly. The dominance of the dollar in international trade, particularly in energy markets, is one of the fundamental pillars of American power. It allows the United States to run massive trade deficits without facing the currency crises that would cripple other nations. It gives Washington enormous leverage through the threat of being cut off from dollar-denominated financial systems. When countries start trading oil in yuan and rupees in their own currencies, it chips away at this edifice of dollar hegemony. Nigeria's move was coordinated with similar initiatives by Saudi Arabia, by the UAE, by Brazil. This isn't just one country going rogue. This is a coordinated effort by major commodity exporters to diversify away from dollar dependence. Trump's response was characteristically blunt. In a statement that shocked even seasoned diplomats, he suggested that any nation that betrays the dollar might face consequences, and he specifically mentioned military options as being on the table for Nigeria. The use of the word vicious in subsequent remarks left little to interpretation. This wasn't diplomatic posturing. This was a threat of violence in response to an economic decision. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about the potential use of military force not to respond to an attack, not to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe, but to compel a sovereign nation to use a particular currency in their international trade. This is economic imperialism backed by the threat of bombs and missiles. The Nigerian response has been remarkably sophisticated. Rather than engaging in the kind of inflammatory rhetoric that would give Washington a pretext for action, Nigerian President Bola Tinubu gave a measured but firm address to the nation. He emphasized that Nigeria sought partnership, not confrontation, but would not be intimidated into abandoning policies designed to benefit the Nigerian people. He reminded the world that Nigeria had never attacked another nation, had always been a force for peacekeeping in Africa, and had fought alongside Western allies against terrorism. But he was equally clear, Nigeria's economic sovereignty was not negotiable. The decision on what currencies to accept for Nigerian resources would be made in Abuja, not in Washington. Behind the scenes, Nigeria has been working furiously on multiple diplomatic fronts. They've reached out to the African Union to invoke collective security provisions. They've been in communication with BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, all of whom have their own reasons to oppose American unilateralism. They've engaged with European nations, many of whom are deeply uncomfortable with Trump's aggressive posture, even as they remain dependent on American security guarantees. Nigeria is essentially trying to build a coalition that would make American military action diplomatically and economically untenable. They're betting that in a multipolar world, even American power has limits. But let's be honest about the risks here. Nigeria is not a military match for the United States, and everyone knows it. If Washington decided to launch strikes, say targeting oil infrastructure or government buildings, Nigeria could not prevent it through military means. What they can do is make such an action politically costly. They can ensure that it would be seen globally not as a legitimate use of force, but as naked aggression designed to enforce economic domination. They can work to ensure that such action would accelerate rather than prevent the decline of American influence in Africa and the global South more broadly. This is asymmetric resistance, using diplomatic and political tools to raise the costs of military action to a level that even a hawkish American administration might find unacceptable. The situation is further complicated by the internal dynamics within Nigeria itself. This is not a politically unified country facing an external threat with a single voice. Nigeria is deeply divided along ethnic, religious, and regional lines. The predominantly Muslim North has different economic interests and international alignments than the largely Christian South. The oil-producing Niger Delta has its own grievances against the federal government in Abuja. There are separatist movements, insurgencies, and a long history of military coups. American intelligence agencies are certainly aware of these fault lines, and there are real concerns in Nigeria that Washington might seek to exploit them, either by supporting opposition groups or by backing regional fragmentation. This is the playbook that's been used before, in Libya, in Syria, in Sudan. When you can't get a government to comply, you work to replace it or fracture the country entirely. Nigerian civil society has been remarkably vocal in this crisis. I've been reading statements from Nigerian academics, journalists, and activists, and there's a palpable sense that this is a defining moment for the nation. Many are framing it in explicitly post-colonial terms, arguing that what's happening now is fundamentally similar to the pressures faced by Patrice Lumumba in Congo, by Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, by any African leader who dared to prioritize African interests over those of former colonial powers and their American successor. There's a recognition that standing up to Washington is dangerous, that it has often ended badly for those who tried, but also a sense that constantly acquiescing has led to decades of underdevelopment and dependency. The question they're asking themselves is profound. Is it better to accept permanent subordination in exchange for avoiding immediate conflict, or to risk confrontation in pursuit of genuine sovereignty? This brings me to what I think is the deeper issue at stake here, something that goes far beyond Nigeria or even Africa. What we're witnessing is the death throes of an international order based on American primacy. For roughly 3 decades after the Cold War ended, the United States enjoyed unparalleled power. There was no nation or bloc of nations that could effectively constrain American action. Washington could invade countries, impose sanctions, determine the terms of international trade, all with minimal consequences. That era is ending, not because America has suddenly become weak in absolute terms, but because the rest of the world has grown stronger and more assertive. China's economy is now comparable to America's in purchasing power terms. India is rising. Brazil, Indonesia, and Nigeria itself represent enormous markets and populations that cannot simply be dictated to anymore. What makes this transition so dangerous is that declining hegemons have historically been the most likely to resort to military force. Think about Britain in the early 20th century, watching its empire fragment and its economic primacy challenged by Germany and the United States. Think about how those tensions contributed to the catastrophe of World War I. There's a real risk that America, rather than managing its decline gracefully and transitioning to a role as first among equals in a multipolar world, will instead lash out militarily to try to maintain dominance. Trump's threat against Nigeria might be seen in this light, not as a rational strategic calculation, but as an emotional reaction to the loss of automatic deference that American presidents had come to expect. The economic dimensions of this confrontation cannot be overstated. Nigeria is not just another African country. It has a population of over 200 million people, making it more populous than Russia, more than twice the population of Germany. It's a young population with a median age in the 20s. This is a massive consumer market that will only grow in importance over the coming decades. It's also blessed with extraordinary natural resources, not just oil and gas, but also solid minerals, agricultural potential, and a strategic location as a gateway to West African markets markets of another 100 million people. American corporations have billions invested in Nigeria. A serious confrontation would put all of that at risk. And if Nigeria successfully resists American pressure, it sets a precedent for other countries. If Nigeria can choose its own currency arrangements, why not Indonesia? Why not Vietnam? Why not Mexico? There's also a military strategic dimension that often gets overlooked. The United States has been working for years to establish a more permanent military presence in West Africa, ostensibly to counter terrorism and to compete with growing Chinese and Russian influence. Nigeria has been resistant to hosting American bases on its territory, allowing only limited security cooperation. Part of what's driving American frustration is the recognition that without Nigerian cooperation, any broader American military strategy for the region becomes much more difficult. Nigeria's location, its military capacity, the largest in West Africa, and its diplomatic influence make it an essential partner. But partnership requires mutual respect and mutual benefit, something American policymakers seem to have forgotten how to offer. Let me address the terrorism issue directly because it's often used to justify American intervention in Nigeria and the broader Sahel region. Yes, Nigeria faces serious security challenges from Boko Haram and its offshoots, from banditry and kidnapping, from intercommunal violence exacerbated by climate change and resource scarcity. But Nigerian security officials will tell you quite candidly that American counterterrorism assistance has been of limited value. The intelligence sharing is selective and often serves American rather than Nigerian priorities. The training programs are disconnected from the realities Nigerian soldiers face on the ground, and the American insistence on applying a purely military solution to what are fundamentally political and economic problems, lack of development, lack of opportunity, lack of governance in the northern regions, has, if anything, made the situation worse. What Nigeria needs is sustained investment in education, infrastructure, and economic opportunity in its most marginalized regions. What it's gotten instead is drones and special forces operations that often alienate local populations. The climate dimension of this crisis is also crucial and rarely discussed. Nigeria is extraordinarily vulnerable to climate change. Rising sea levels threaten Lagos and other coastal cities. Desertification is pushing herders south into conflict with farmers. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more severe. Nigeria is trying to develop its fossil fuel resources to fund the economic transformation that would allow it to adapt to these challenges and eventually transition to cleaner energy. But Western nations, having built their own prosperity on fossil fuels, are now demanding that Nigeria essentially skip that stage of development and move directly to renewable energy, without providing anything close to the financial and technological support that would make that feasible. So when Western leaders lecture Nigeria about climate responsibility while simultaneously threatening them over currency choices, the hypocrisy is breathtaking. Nigeria is trying to chart a pragmatic course, use resource revenues now to build resilience and fund development while gradually transitioning to a more sustainable model. But they're being told they must choose between poverty and climate action, which is no choice at all. I want to come back to Trump's specific threat and what vicious military action might entail, because this is not abstract. We're potentially talking about airstrikes, about special operations raids, about cyber attacks on Nigerian infrastructure. The playbook exists because it's been used before. Limited strikes designed to punish without occupying, to demonstrate power without starting a prolonged war. The problem is that such actions are never as clean or limited as their planners imagine. Strikes miss targets and kill civilians. Infrastructure attacks have cascading effects on populations, and the political consequences are entirely unpredictable. American action against Nigeria could trigger a broader crisis across West Africa. It could lead to attacks on American citizens and interests across the continent. It could push Nigeria decisively into the arms of China and Russia, exactly the outcome Washington claims to want to prevent. This is the madness of trying to solve political problems through military means. There's also the question of legality and precedent. What legal basis would the United States have for attacking Nigeria? There's no UN Security Council resolution authorizing force. Nigeria has not attacked the United States or any American ally. They've made an economic decision about currency arrangements. If that becomes grounds for military action, then we've essentially abandoned any pretense of international law. Every country would be on notice that their economic sovereignty exists only at the sufferance of Washington and can be revoked at any moment through violence. This would be the international order reduced to pure might makes right, which is ultimately unsustainable because it would drive every nation to seek security through their own military capacity or through alliances specifically designed to counter American power. Let me talk about what I think should happen, what a rational American policy would look like. First, Washington needs to acknowledge that Nigeria and other nations have legitimate interests that don't always align with American preferences. That's normal in international relations. It's not betrayal or aggression. It's sovereignty. Second, if America wants Nigeria to remain oriented toward the West, the way to achieve that is through positive inducements, not threats. Offer Nigeria the kind of development partnership it's been asking for. Invest in Nigerian infrastructure. Facilitate technology transfers. Support Nigerian businesses and entrepreneurs. Make the relationship with America more attractive than the relationship with China, not through military threats, but through genuine partnership. Third, on the dollar issue specifically, recognize that currency diversification is going to happen whether we like it or not. The question is whether it happens gradually and orderly, or whether American resistance accelerates it and makes it more chaotic. Except that in a multipolar world, there will be multiple reserve currencies and multiple payment systems. That's not the end of American prosperity. It's an adjustment to new realities. But I'm not optimistic that this rational approach will prevail. The reason is that American foreign policy is driven not primarily by strategic calculation, but by domestic politics and by powerful interest groups. There are defense contractors who profit from militarized foreign policy. There are financial institutions that benefit from dollar dominance. There are politicians who build their careers on projecting American toughness. All of these groups have a vested interest in confrontation rather than accommodation, and there's a broader cultural issue, a deep reluctance to accept that American power has limits, that other nations have valid perspectives, that the world cannot and will not be organized solely around American preferences. This cultural resistance to multipolarity is perhaps the biggest obstacle to a peaceful transition to a more balanced international system. So where does this leave us? We have Nigeria determined to maintain its sovereignty over economic decisions. We have an American administration threatening violence to enforce its preferences. We have a world watching to see whether American power can still compel compliance, or whether we've reached a tipping point where even threats of military force are insufficient to prevent nations from pursuing independent policies. The next few weeks and months are genuinely dangerous. There are so many ways this could escalate, so many possibilities for miscalculation. A Nigerian oil facility gets sabotaged and fingers point at American intelligence. An American citizen in Nigeria gets kidnapped or attacked, providing a pretext for retaliation. A Nigerian military exercise gets misinterpreted as preparation for some action that triggers an American response. These are the kinds of accidents that can spiral into larger conflicts, especially when trust is absent and both sides are operating under worst-case assumptions about the other's intentions. What gives me some measure of hope is the sheer absurdity of what's being proposed. The idea that the United States would go to war with Nigeria over currency arrangements is so obviously disproportionate, so clearly counterproductive, that one hopes calmer heads will prevail. There are still adults in Washington, still people in the Pentagon and State Department who understand that military force is not a Swiss Army knife that can solve every problem. There are still members of Congress who would ask hard questions about any proposed military action. There are still American business leaders who would recognize that a conflict with Nigeria would be economically catastrophic for American interests in Africa. So perhaps the threat itself is the strategy. Make the threat credible enough that Nigeria backs down, but never actually intend to follow through. The problem with that approach is that if Nigeria calls the bluff, what then? Either you back down and your threats become meaningless, or you follow through and start a conflict you never really wanted. This is ultimately about what kind of world we want to live in. Do we want a world where might makes right, where the strong can dictate terms to the weak through threats of violence? Or do we want a world governed by rules and norms, where even small countries have rights that must be respected, where disputes are resolved through dialogue and negotiation rather than coercion? The uncomfortable truth is that the United States has often claimed to support the latter while practicing the former. We've said we believe in sovereignty and self-determination, but we've intervened when countries made choices we didn't like. We've said we support democracy, but we've backed coups against democratically elected governments that weren't sufficiently pro-American. This gap between rhetoric and reality has corroded American credibility, particularly in the global South, where the memories of intervention and exploitation remain fresh. Nigeria's situation is a test case for whether that's changing, whether we're moving toward a more genuinely equitable international order, or whether we're just going to see the same old patterns play out again. Will Nigeria be allowed to chart its own course, or will it be forced to submit through threats or violence? Will other African nations stand with Nigeria, or will fear of American power lead them to stay silent? Will European nations, will Asian nations, will Latin American nations speak up for principles of sovereignty and non-interference, or will they calculate that their own interests are best served by acquiescing to American action? These are the questions that will define the international order for decades to come, and they're being answered right now in real time. I want to end by saying something about our own responsibilities as Americans. We cannot simply be spectators to these events. This is being done in our name, with our tax dollars, by leaders we elect. If we find this course of action wrong, if we believe that threatening war over currency arrangements is immoral and counterproductive, then we have an obligation to speak up. Contact your representatives, support organizations working for a more peaceful and just foreign policy, push back against the militaristic assumptions that dominate our political discourse, recognize that American security is not enhanced by making the world fear us, but by making the world respect us, and respect cannot be compelled through force. It must be earned through actions that demonstrate genuine commitment to mutual benefit and shared prosperity. Nigeria is not our enemy. The Nigerian people are not our enemies. They're human beings trying to build better lives for themselves and their children, just like we are. Their success is not a threat to us. It's something we should welcome and support. That's the mentality shift that's desperately needed. And without it, I fear we're headed for a confrontation that will benefit no one and harm everyone involved.
Thank you for watching. If you're new to this channel, consider subscribing so you won't miss out any of our latest video.